Weren't you saying the other day you wanted to talk a little bit about the problem of evil?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Okay, we can start there. Go from there.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay.
So should I maybe articulate what the problem of evil is, and then you can
Sure.
give me your thoughts on it?
Yeah.
So in my understanding, the problem of evil states that the common interpretation of the Judeo-Christian God involves an all-knowing, all-good deity.
Mm-hmm.
But when we look around the world, it seems like there's a lot of suffering in the world, a lot of evil in the world that doesn't seem necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by necessary is that it doesn't lead to goals that we would otherwise deem to be worth the suffering that is preceding that goal. So, like for example, in Indonesia, the earthquake that happened a few years ago left a lot of people buried who would have died slow deaths that were painful.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not clear how the world would have benefited from their slow dying. So, from an evidential point of view, this seems like a good reason to not believe in an all-good deity. What do you think about that?
Right, like I meet people all the time that say that I can't believe that we have on one side, we have God exists, and God is good, God is all good, and all-knowing. And then on the other side, we have this problem of evil. We see that evil things happen. Children get cancer and die at an early age, or there's terrible atrocities committed on people, and we have wars and natural disasters, etc., right? And so a lot of people would see this as a contradiction. They would say that, like, God can't be all good, and there can't be evil in the world. There's a problem there. And so the way that I would view that is that the way that God has set up the world is like God's goal for the world is that the most amount of people would come into a free will, loving relationship with Him. And so this would have to be a free choice, and it would have to be a choice infused with love. And so love, to be real, has to have this element of choice and freedom, right? And so in the world today, we see a lot of people who have freedom, and they use that freedom for evil purposes, right? Like people who commit atrocities against other people, right? This is a consequence of people being given this free choice. Because if God were to step in and stop things, like stop atrocities, right, He would actually be removing people's free will. And so without that free will, they wouldn't be able to come into a loving relationship with God of their free choice. With natural disasters and stuff like that,
Mm-hmm.
Like with earthquakes and tsunamis, etc., like people, like one of their first cries is that this doesn't seem fair, that they cry out to God and ask why. And this what many Christians and myself would point to is this is the fallen nature of the world. Like this is God's world, but His kingdom is not fully come into the world. Like the world still has this, because sin has entered the world. The world is not a perfect place. Like the world we view as one day will be perfect when God's kingdom comes back down to earth, right? And it'll be a perfect place then. But right now, that's kind of where we're at. And so the problem of evil, to show that, because a lot of people say that it's contradictory. So evil exists and God exists. There's a contradiction there. So I would say that for it to be a contradiction, you would show that it's not possible. I would say that the reason that we can see it as being compatible is that we can see in our limited knowledge that we cry for justice, we say why, and we can know that we don't have a limited perspective of just this time on earth. We see, like, for example, evil people go unpunished. Certain people, evil people go unpunished. We say, where's the justice? Well, as Christians, we view that one day there will be justice, right? That justice will happen. We also see that there's a lot of situations we can't explain. We can point to a greater good. We say that some good will come from this, but it doesn't have to. We're not limited to this world, because when the problem of evil is in the Bible, it's infused in the Bible, but I think it comes to a head in the person of Jesus Christ. because he was crucified like the Son of God, a perfect person was crucified. It was one of the most evil things that has ever happened. But it turned out for us in the world to be one of the greatest things that's ever happened. Some good came out of suffering and evil.
Okay, so it seems like you made 4 points there. So right off the bat, I wanted to clarify that I'm not making a logical argument of evil.
Right.
I'm making an evidential argument. So I'm not saying that the existence of God is impossible because there seems to be evil in the world. What I'm saying is that the prevalence of, or the pervasiveness of seemingly unnecessary suffering, it counts against, it seems to count against the proposition that there is an all-good, all-knowing deity. So that's in response to the third point you made about the logical problem of evil requiring showing that that every instance of suffering doesn't have a greater purpose behind it. All I'm saying is that it seems like there is suffering in the world that isn't necessary, and that it's not clear, do you know what I mean, what the purpose is behind it.
Right.
So that the atheist, or that just the person investigating this matter, is warranted in saying, I'm not sure about that claim that there is an all-good God. You also said that God stepping in and stopping people from committing atrocities to other people compromises free will, so that we can't engage in a free relationship with God. But I don't see that those two things are related necessarily, because it seems like God could make it impossible for people to hurt one another without compromising free will. Like, for example, people who drive recklessly have their driving license taken away, right? But that doesn't prevent them from having, a loving relationship with police officers, for example, right? Or whoever they might want to have a loving relationship with.
Okay.
So it seems like God could step in and not even necessarily interfere with people's freedom, like their psychological freedom, but just make it impossible for them to do the thing that they wanted to do to hurt the other person. Do you know what I mean?
I think you're trying to say like God could form our brains in a way that we would never have the...
No, I'm not saying that. I'm actually saying that just the physical means for hurting one another would be contravened.
But there's so much of the way that people take advantage and hurt other people that has nothing to do with physical means. Like it's a corporation signing papers that takes away people's water source, or something like that, or somebody who sells somebody into forced prostitution, that person maybe has no hands on it. So there's so much of evil, like the majority, or a nuclear weapon that's pressed with just a button. A lot of it has nothing to do with physicality.
Sure, but all I'm saying is that there seem to be some cases where God could step in. I'm not even saying right now that God needs to step in at every single juncture possible.
Right.
I'm just saying that we don't see any, stepping in, or at least it seems to me. And so that's what I see as the problem. So I find it difficult to, do you know what I mean?
So if God was all good, he would step in sometimes. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
At least sometimes.
Well, as a Christian, I think that God does step in sometimes. I don't call upon those instances as evidence, but I do believe that miracles happen today. And so, but I don't, unless it's recorded, I would never cite it as evidence. But on a theological point of view, I do think that God steps in. I think that miracles are a lot more rare than what we actually hear about in the media today. Even in the Bible, I think that miracles are actually, they're located at very specific times around specific purposes. The Bible's not full of miracles. That's not what the story tells, but I do think that miracles happen today, that God does step in. One thing I do want to kind of say too, that when we discuss this issue, especially among Christians, we understand that this is the main problem of this is an emotional problem. The person who's lost their child, I wouldn't go to them with philosophical answers and immediately say, well, hey, there's a greater good coming,
Right.
and this is why. And let me show you some instances in the past. Like this is the main issue of this is emotional, but that's why it's so big. That's why everybody has an opinion on it. But I do think that the emotional barrier to it can be dealt with, but I think that mainly we're talking about it as a philosophical issue, because this is an issue that touches everyone. As far as like God jumping in, I don't know if I could agree that he should jump in sometimes, like because I think that he does, but for him to be expected to, I don't know where we would draw the line. Like, do we say that God should have stopped in and stopped 1 million people from dying? Why not 900,000, right? Like, where do we draw these lines that we would say that God is good? Like, what if 50 people are going to die? Should God have stepped in?
Well, it seems to me, for us to say that God is all good, then God would have to step in to the maximum logically possible.
Well,
but the fact that we don't even see God, like you're saying God does intervene occasionally, and that seems to me hugely problematic, because you're saying God actually, it doesn't actually contradict having a free relationship with God, for God to intervene, because he does it sometimes. It's just very rare. So the fact that you're saying it does happen, but it's just rare, I mean, that makes me even more uncomfortable with the idea of a God. It just seems like, I mean, imagine a brain surgeon who is the only brain surgeon who's able to perform a certain operation in all of the world, right?
okay.
And this brain surgeon has the ability to fly around the world with total freedom.
Right.
And yet, of all of the cases that this person's skill is beneficial, could help, he just chooses a few, off chance incidents to go and help people. I mean, would we view that person as being good? It doesn't seem to me that we would. It seems to me that we would.
I'm not sure, because we do see that situation. Like, for example, with like American doctors, right? Like, we have the best doctors in the world. They get $20 million paychecks, but they only help certain people. They don't help everybody, right? So I don't know if I would call them evil or not good. I don't know if I would say that.
I'm not saying that God is evil. I'm saying that
or just not good.
Yeah.
Or not all good.
Yeah. Well, we don't think that those highly lucrative doctors who are very selective in which patients they treat are all good, do we?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that they're all good.
Right.
So I just think that like we do actually see that. But when I get asked the question, why did this happen to my child, or why did this happen in the world? My first response is, I don't know.
Right.
Right? Like, it really is.
Yeah.
I don't know. I do accept that God's ways are higher than ours. Like, we've all heard that line before. But like in these kind of situations where I don't know what God's purposes are. But I can trust in what I know about God to know that there is a purpose.
There should be a higher.
The problem, I think, that when most people use this as an argumentative point is to say, like, why isn't the world more perfect today? God's purposes for the world is not that we're his pets. Like, because if I have pets, I would want them to have the best life that they could possibly have in their short existence. I would intervene if there was evil. I would fix every problem that they have. But we're not God's pets, right? Like, God in the Bible judges people tough, very tough sometimes. God is known for sometimes giving tough love, and then other times he's known for giving this very sacrificial love, right? So God has purposes that I don't fully understand, but I can't take the viewpoint that I'm God's pet and I deserve the best life possible, and that he should make everything as easy for me as I want, and make everything as easy and happy for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what it comes down to is that I don't see God's intervening in our lives as compromising the authentic adult relationship that we could have with God. Whereas the way that you phrase it is like, if God were to do that, he'd be treating us in this sort of condescending pet relationship. And I guess I just don't see that. And it doesn't seem to me to hold in human relationships where we would turn to, a good Samaritan and say, how condescending of you to apply your first aid skills to this person that was dying. Like, don't you see how you compromise this person's like ability to live an authentic life? It's like, no, that person. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's a strange way of understanding
I think that
intervention.
if I were to fall in love with, and I were to marry a girl, and I were to say, we were having this great relationship, but I was just going to take away a couple of her abilities or a couple of her prerogatives or abilities to do things that could affect that loving relationship. Like if I were to say, I don't want her to interact with other men, because then she couldn't have the ability to cheat on me, right? If I were to force her to stay home, right, and I'd say this is for the good of our loving relationship, I would be taking away her ability to cheat on me, which would be okay, and it wouldn't affect our loving relationship. But then I would be controlling her, right? We know what those guys are like that do that, right? They control their women to stay at home and not interact with other people and want to know where they are at all times. I would, even though that could come from a place of love that would stop, because the things like adultery and cheating and divorce, these are terrible things that hurt people terribly, right? Sometimes generations back, right? And I could say this is my good purpose to avoid adultery and divorce by locking you in the house and not letting you interact with other men. It would actually be a terrible thing. I would be like a puppeteer, or I would have a gun to her head pretty much saying, you must love me this way, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that taking away any faculties to hurt other people wouldn't be love.
But it seems to me that's not what's at stake. Like that, it doesn't seem to me that's the analogy, that's the appropriate comparison to what's going on with us and God. It seems like what that would imply is God stopping us from having intellectual doubts, from worshiping other gods, from going to other churches or something like that. That seems to me more comparable to what you're talking about with like coercing your partner to love you. I mean, with the whole partner relationships, it seems more comparable to say that a doctor or a police officer or somebody that can help other people is in a relationship with someone who is suffering in a certain way, and they refuse to even help that person be relieved of their suffering, and when all of their friends are like, hey, don't you see that your partner can benefit from the skills that you have, from the knowledge that you have? And their response is, yes, I do, but if I were to help my partner, then she wouldn't love me in the way that she is able to love me when I'm not helping her. Like that seems like a sort of a manipulative, coercive kind of a response, don't you think?
In that regard, we do see that, right? We see that in parents and children, right? We see parents, sometimes they have the ability to help their children, and they even have the urge to help their children, but they don't.
Right.
They don't for their better good. I think that we all know there's lots of examples of that, right? Like your kid falling off his bike, for example, right? Why wouldn't you just hold him the whole time while you let him fall so he gets back up and becomes a tested person, right? Somebody who perseveres. And then we can see the greater good in that. And so I think just because we can have a small glimpse, right? Like God is eternal, and we're a very limited people. If we can just get a glimpse of why God would allow bad things to happen to good people, right? If we can just get a little bit of a glimpse, I think then we can, in our sense, since God is much bigger than we are, that we can start to work on that, right? Like I don't have the definitive answer, right? But I can at least, I have hope, because I've seen it in the person of God himself, that he suffered for a greater good, and that with, in my own experience, I can see why I would allow people to suffer sometimes for their greater good. So I don't have the exact answer, but
right.
I'm working on it.
So I think first of all, before I say what I want to say, it seems like ultimately this comes down to the question of faith, which is like another topic I guess we can talk about.
Right.
On the example of the parent-child relationship, I think that's a really good example, and I wanted to ask you something.
Okay.
Do you think that we can ever recognize a parent as being negligent of their children or of their child?
Yeah, we have laws in place.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's what it seems to me, that if it's possible to recognize that a parent can be negligent,
yeah.
then just in the same way, it's possible to recognize that God's relationship with us is one of negligence rather than allowing us to fail and grow from that. And the reason why I say that is because it doesn't seem like these instances of suffering that I'm referring to involve any greater good or any learning experience. And if ultimately all we're left with is we have to have faith that there is a greater purpose, then it seems like by that same argument we couldn't ever recognize a negligent parent, because the parent can always say, yes, I let my child bleed for hours. I let my child suffer with a tooth infection, ear infection. And I recognize that you can't see the purpose for that, and I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I want you to believe that there is a greater purpose. It seems like we would just say, you know what, you might have a deeper intention there that I'm not even recognizing, but you're a negligent parent, and we can't trust you with the caring of this child. So just from an evidential point of view, the comparison to parents seems problematic because, yeah.
I would agree that it's possible to build a case that either God is negligent or he isn't. Like, I think that's possible. I think it's different than if his God is good. So I think that would be an interesting road to go down. But I think as far as like the idea of letting somebody bleed out or something like that, when we say, for example, why doesn't God feed people in people that are starving in Africa, right? Like, we thank God for our food here, but there's people starving in Africa. Where's God? We say, God, why don't you do something about that? But I think it's very clear in the Bible that God is saying, when we ask that question, he's saying, why don't you do something about that, right? Like, it's not just God and us, like God has left us to take care of each other. And so like God is actually, I don't know, like if you could take it to a parent, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but maybe there's babysitters in place, that a parent isn't just allowing the child to bleed out, but there's also a bunch of babysitters standing around also watching, going, why doesn't the parent do something? Well, what about the babysitters, right? God has set up a system in place that we can take care of the whole world, but we don't, right? We can feed the whole world, but we don't. We can provide clean water to the whole world, but we don't, right? And so I think that's an intangible that you'd have to include that I really don't know how to do that right now. I can only just ask questions right now.
Well, I guess I would object to the idea that we actually can relieve all of the suffering in the world. I mean, even today with all of our technology and means and resources, I think that like going just back to the example of the earthquake in Indonesia, where people were buried by rubble and suffered for hours before dying. We don't have, like, even that could have happened in the United States. That could have happened in the most technologically, economically advanced country in the world. So it just doesn't seem to me to be true. I mean, and that's the real tragedy of it to me. It seems like we really actually do need a God. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's the tragedy, is that there's so much suffering in the world that we actually can't attend to. And I appreciate what you're saying, that we aren't doing nearly anything close to what we're like morally required to do for one another. But what I'm saying is, even if we did all of that, it seems to fall short. And that's where it seems like it would be so amazing if there were a God to pick up that slack where human beings can't get it done. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know. I agree with you completely. Like, no matter how good we are to each other, we're still going to have terrible natural disasters, and we're still going to have people that are going to take advantage of that system. But then again, like I was saying earlier, like God's purposes for this world is not to have a perfect place where we're without suffering. That's just not God's. God wouldn't pick up that slack because that's not God's purposes for the world.
Yeah. And I mean, this is where it comes down to believing that there is a greater purpose, I think, which takes us to the issue of faith. So I think we've covered that topic pretty well, pretty extensively.